On the morning of Thanksgiving, I would wake up to the home smelling of all good things, wafting upstairs to my room. I would set the table with the fancy silverware and china and hope that my parents and grandmother wouldn't have the annual Thanksgiving fight about Richard Nixon. If George W. Bush is given a second term, and retains a Republican Congress and a compliant federal judiciary, he and his allies are likely to embark on a campaign of political retribution the likes of which we haven't seen since Richard Nixon. Article 2 of the Articles of Impeachment against Richard Nixon was just the simple fact that he talked about and suggested the potential use of the IRS against one or two political opponents. Watergate showed more strengths in our system than weaknesses. The whole country did take part in quite a genuine sense in passing judgment on Richard Nixon. I have seen periods of progress followed by reaction. I have seen the hopes and aspirations of Negroes rise during World War II, only to be smashed during the Eisenhower years. I am seeing the victories of the Kennedy and Johnson administrations destroyed by Richard Nixon. I think we're at risk with our democracy. I think we're dealing with the most closed, imperialistic, nastiest administration in living memory. They even put Richard Nixon to shame. Public school was never in business to produce Thoreau. It is in business to produce a man like Richard Nixon and, even more, a population like the one which could elect him. I'm old enough to remember Richard Nixon. They called it the imperial presidency when he was refusing to spend money that Congress had appropriated. Do you realize the responsibility I carry? I'm the only person standing between Richard Nixon and the White House. Previous presidents, including great ones like Roosevelt, have used the IRS against their enemies. But I don't think Barack Obama ever wanted to be on the same page as Richard Nixon. For Obama to save himself, he should be thinking about the example of an unlikely Republican predecessor, Richard Nixon. I see a direct line between Kennedy and Richard Nixon and the opening to China and the détente with the Soviet Union. The death of JFK to the resignation of Richard Nixon marked a great turning point in American life. Richard Nixon had a kind of Walter Mitty fantasy life. He was a man with grandiose thoughts. Dreams of not simply being president but maybe becoming one of the truly great presidents of American history. Richard Nixon was the best thing that ever happened to journalism. I mean, this guy was wonderful. Just when you thought he could get no worse, he got worse. I've said it before, Barack Obama is really the president Richard Nixon always wanted to be. You know, he's been allowed to act unilaterally in a way that we've fought for decades. I grew up in the era when Dan rather hated Richard Nixon. He was a newsman, but you knew what his opinion was. John F. Kennedy went to bed at 3:30 in the morning on November 9, 1960, uncertain whether he had defeated Richard Nixon for the presidency. He thought he had won, but 6 states hung in the balance, and after months of exhaustive campaigning, he was too tired to stay awake any longer. I woke up one morning with this song in my head, and the opening line of the song is, "My name was Richard Nixon, only now I'm a girl." I remember the day Richard Nixon won in 1968. That was a time that seemed certain to bring about long-awaited seismic change in America. But events of tragic proportion took us on a turn. Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King, Jr. were suddenly dead. Congressional Republicans are dismantling the limited environmental protections initiated by Richard Nixon, who would be something of a dangerous radical in today's political scene. During the Cold War, America undertook serious military cuts only once, after the election of Richard Nixon, during the Vietnam War. The result, Vietnam fell to the Communists, the Russians moved into Afghanistan, and American influence around the globe waned dramatically. More than half the combat deaths in Vietnam occurred after Richard Nixon was elected on a promise to bring the war to an end, and after the American people had already decided that they did not want one more soldier to die in Vietnam. I met Gerald Ford. I met Richard Nixon. I met Jimmy Carter. I met Dwight Eisenhower when he was a general. George Bush Sr. I haven't met Bill Clinton or George W. Bush, although I got a letter from him. Richard Nixon is typically considered the modern exemplar of a dark and vindictive president. President Trump would be Nixon minus the keen intellect and work ethic. We've got the NSA getting logs of every call you make. The IRS is weaponized like Richard Nixon could only have dreamed of. Successful presidential campaigns follow a two-part strategy. For Republicans, Richard Nixon described it as running to the right in the primaries and running back to the center in the general election. For Democrats, the idea is to go to the left in the primaries, then to the center. Richard Nixon was an evil man, evil in a way that only those who believe in the physical reality of the devil can understand it. He was utterly without ethics or morals or any bedrock sense of decency. Avoid all needle drugs, the only dope worth shooting is Richard Nixon. Since the time of Richard Nixon, there has been a strange lack of will in the media to identify the real cause for Americans' anger at politicians who fall, publicly and spectacularly. Think about one of the most powerful influences on a young child's life, the absence of a father figure. Look back on recent presidents, and you'll find an absent, or weak, or failed father in the lives of Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. And I also thought that Richard Nixon was the greatest political education we have ever had, but it looks like we need to relearn them again. Though it was never a goal in life, it has occurred to me that I've met 6 presidents of the United States. Okay, I met 4 of them before they became president, including Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush, number 43. Do I trust Yasser Arafat? Of course not. Why should I? Why should anyone trust a politician, whether Shimon Peres, Ariel Sharon, Bill Clinton, Richard Nixon, Lyndon Johnson, Benjamin Netanyahu, George W. Bush, or Yasser Arafat? I think that Richard Nixon is a great man and that he is very dedicated to what he does. I had the pleasure of meeting him when I attended the Republican National Convention in Miami. You can really tell that he is willing to go out of his way to help the American people. The fact of the Watergate cover-up is not nearly as interesting as the step into making the cover-up. And when you understand the step, you understand that Richard Nixon lied, that he was a criminal. I'd walk over my own grandmother to re-elect Richard Nixon. By disgracing and degrading the presidency of the United States, by fleeing the White House like a diseased cur, Richard Nixon broke the heart of the American dream. Experience helped Richard Nixon, but it didn't save him, and it certainly wasn't a blanket endorsement. He blundered terribly in dealing with Vietnam. The revival of the right is as extraordinary as it would be if the public had demanded dozens of new nuclear plants in the days after the 3 Mile Island disaster. If we had reacted to Watergate by making Richard Nixon a national hero. I remember, as a kid, nothing struck me funnier than seeing Richard Nixon look into the camera and sincerely tell everyone he didn't know where the 18 minutes had gone from his tapes. But there was all this sweat on his upper lip. We knew he was lying. He knew we knew he was lying. But he was determined to tell the lie. I sometimes lie awake at night trying to think of something funny that Richard Nixon said. Libertarians are essentially what the Republicans were 30 years ago. Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan. They'd all fit more under the libertarian label than the modern-day Republican label. John Kennedy won the first televised presidential debate among those watching it, while Richard Nixon won among those listening on the radio. In my mind, the re-election of Richard Nixon, compared with what was available on the other side, was so much more important that I put it in just that context. If Obama's vision of the public sector is socialism, then so too were the visions of Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and Richard Nixon. What makes me laugh? Richard Nixon always made me laugh. It is my personal plan to assassinate by pistol either Richard Nixon or George Wallace. Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan. They'd all fit more under the libertarian label than the modern-day Republican label. Frost was no match for Nixon. Far from being an intrepid and challenging interviewer, he was a pushover for the great and the famous, always deeply impressed with the fact that here he was, David Frost, putting questions to Richard Nixon. Visit our website for more quotes, quoting.com.